Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. And thanks for inviting me. If you can in the chat just put in where you're coming from, and I'm not very good at looking at chat and talking, but I will try to take a glance so I can see where everybody is coming from. But I am really happy to be here to talk to you about best practices in working with parents with disabilities. And I'm going to, whoops. What I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of background about parents with disabilities, including the history, the policy, and research, some core concepts that are helpful when you're working with or advocating with parents with disabilities, or if you are a parent with a disability yourself, and some promising practice models. And I will leave you with some resources that hopefully are helpful too. And I did want to note that this presentation and these presentations I've been doing around Arizona are funded by the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. And Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council actually funded 3 different projects on working with parents with disabilities, which is absolutely fantastic. I've been doing work on this topic for about 15 years or maybe more. And there's really not a whole lot going on in funding for this topic and research on this topic. And so I came to Arizona a few years ago, and I was actually shocked when I saw that they had this grant focusing specifically on parents with disabilities. But what I've been doing is going around the state and training social workers and social service providers on working with parents with disabilities. And I'll tell you a little bit more about my research as we go. I wanted to start off first with a little video. I hope it works here. If you're not hearing anything when it goes, I tried to share it with sound, let me know, but just to sort of get you in the mood here a little bit.
You go. Jen Thomas knows some people question her ability to be a parent.
I think society looks at people with disabilities as people who need constant care, and that's not true.
Thomas has cerebral palsy, but she and her husband DJ always wanted to be parents, regardless of her disability.
It's about love and having the ability to love and bond with your children.
Even so, a new report from the National Council on Disability has found that many disabled parents still risk losing their children, and that troubles some experts.
You should start with the idea that a kid should be with the kid's parents. If there is a situation where the child's genuinely in danger, then obviously not.
But he says that can often be prevented if parents have adequate support. Karen Tamley, who has a rare spinal disorder, and her husband adopted their daughter. 6-year-old Dominica has Apert syndrome, a genetic disorder that causes facial deformities, among other things.
You know, when I was growing up, neither of my parents had a disability, so you don't have those role models out there in your immediate family. And so I think that's one of the benefits that she's going to have growing up, is that she looks different and I look different.
Dominica's father, meanwhile, is a hemophiliac who contracted HIV from a blood transfusion.
She sees I take medicine and I give myself shots sometimes, but she doesn't really understand what it means.
But ask Dominica about her parents, and it's really quite simple.
Hey, I love them. Bye.
It's about love. Martha Irvin, Associated Press.
Okay, that says new report. This is actually 10 years old. So this came out when a big report by the National Council on Disability came out called Rocking the Cradle. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go on. I like to show that, so since I'm doing this presentation, to give you a little flavor of like what it really means here. So to give some historical background, parents with disabilities have experienced, or I'd say people with disabilities, but people with disabilities related to their parenting have experienced horrible discrimination for centuries. And in the early 20th century, in the United States as well as elsewhere, it got worse. And people with disabilities were routinely sterilized against their will. So they were sterilized involuntarily. And this practice was formalized into state law. So the first state that actually had a law saying that it was legal to involuntarily sterilize a parent or a person with a disability was passed in the early 1900s, in 1907 in Indiana, and then a number of other states followed suit, and it culminated with Virginia passing a law in the 1920s, which led to a famous Supreme Court case, and that's what this picture is. So this picture is Carrie Buck on the left, and her mother, and that the case was called Buck versus Bell in 1927, and the Supreme Court ruled in this case that it was constitutional to involuntarily sterilize what they called in the Supreme Court case the unfit. So I'm using that bad language that they're using. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, who is this very famous Supreme Court justice, said in support of his argument that the interests of public welfare outweigh the interests of individuals in their own bodily integrity. And he said the horrible quote at the time that in the decision that said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So this is the kind of language that was going on back in the 1920s. So this, after this happened, then there were thousands of parents or people with disabilities, not parents, people with disabilities who were sterilized without their consent, including 8,000 in Virginia alone in the following years. So this practice sort of withered out, especially after World War II. But it's kind of morphed into this new practice we have, which is taking babies away from parents with disabilities at their birth or from mothers and fathers with disabilities as they grow up. And so this is still happening today, and that's what we're talking about with the child protection system. So a little background researchy sort of stuff. So what do we know? Well, first of all, we know that people with disabilities have kids. There's lots of parents with disabilities. There always have been. There always will be. We don't have great data on it, but we can estimate that about 10+% of people with the parents have a disability. I think that's probably actually higher. That's a conservative estimate. And parents with all types of disabilities. We also know, and this is the part that's really troubling, and this is a lot of the research that I've been doing has been looking at this prevalence. We know that if a parent has a disability, they're much more likely to be reported for child abuse by mandated reporters or others, child abuse and neglect. If they are reported, they're much more likely to have this abuse substantiated, or the child protection system says, yes, abuse or neglect really did happen. They're much more likely to have their children placed into foster care or other types of out-of-home care, and they're much more likely to have their rights terminated. So all along the lines, we're seeing that a parent with a disability more likely to get involved in the child protection system, and then all the way through they're having worse results. And the reporting thing is especially problematic, and people have have different ideas about why this happens, and they usually talk about what's known in the child welfare world is the exposure hypothesis. So the exposure hypothesis means that people with disabilities are more likely to have mandated reporters in their lives. So they're having people in their house, maybe their personal care attendants, other sorts of service providers, and those folks are mandated reporters, so they're more likely to have a report. And people have used this hypothesis for other types of overrepresentation, particular racial disparities and overrepresentation, and they're not really clear if that makes sense there, but it really seems like that makes sense here for parents with disabilities, because they do have more people in their lives. And then there's the stigma and doubts that the mandated reporters have, so they're likely to report. We also know that social service providers, including these mandated reporters, but others too, get very little training on supporting parents with disabilities, on understanding disability. And child protection workers in particular get very little training on supporting parents with disabilities, or understanding disability or assessing disability. So this leads into it as well. And then we also know that there's very few services and supports for parents with disabilities. Someone did a sort of national review of this a while back and found only, several dozen programs across the country that were programs focused specifically on supporting parents with disabilities. Sometimes there's informal support groups, but having actual formal services for parents with disabilities is actually not very common. And I don't believe there are any in Arizona that are like a program focused just on parents with disabilities. Okay, so just to give you a little policy background, so there's all sorts of policies that affect parents with disabilities, but for child protection, those are all state level policies. And I'll show you Arizona's state level policy. So every state has a child welfare statute that relates to termination of parental rights. And I won't read this whole thing because it's in legal jargon, but this is essentially the grounds for terminating parental rights. And they'll list all sorts of grounds such as abuse or neglect. But this one has number 3 is that the parent is unable to discharge parental responsibilities because of mental illness, mental deficiency, and then it goes on to talk about drugs and alcohol. Mental deficiency, we haven't used that term like for 50 years, so it's got this old language in it. And sometime I'm going to dig in and try to find out where that came from, because we actually find this all over the state statutes across the country. And this is actually when I really got interested in parents with disabilities. I've been interested in how people with disabilities get served by social service providers broadly. And I was actually doing some projects related to kids with disabilities. And I don't even remember what inspired me to do this, but I was looking up a state statute and I saw that language, and it wasn't in Arizona, it was somewhere else. And then I thought, how common is that language to actually have parental disability listed as the grounds for termination of parental rights? And I went through every state and I found that 37 of the states had almost the same type of language about focusing on a parent's disability as grounds for termination. And that's really the only like personal characteristic that's listed as grounds for termination. They tend to be behaviors people do, except for disability is for something you are. So we don't have anything that says anything like if a parent is poor, that's grounds for termination of parental rights. And we might have if they're neglecting their kids, so something they're doing. But for disability, what happened when we had this language is then it made the child protection system and the courts focus on showing that a parent had a disability rather than assessing if they were able to parent or not. After we did the study and we were my colleagues and I were talking around, we were trying to get people to do something about this, and we were getting a lot of resistance back, and this is in the early 2000s, that there were some disability groups that didn't even want to touch this back then. But the National Council on Disability took it up, and they actually and this was like my highlight of my career, they actually wrote the report that sort of was based on this research we'd done, and said that we should not be discriminating against parents with disabilities, that states should change this language in their state laws, and actually the ADA should apply to providing non-discriminatory services to parents with disabilities. So that was the Rocking the Cradle report. And since that happened, and that video I showed at the beginning was right after this report was released in 2012, there have been some states that have now changed their language and actually say that parents with disabilities, that they have to protect the rights of parents with disabilities. And for example, parents should have individualized services, that parents should be able to show what types of supports they use to help parent their kids if they get involved in the child protection system. There's actually been lots of confusion about whether the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the main act protecting against the anti-discrimination law for parents with disabilities, and how that affects the child protection. And there were lots of court cases around the country, and they would sort of be inconclusive and never come down to whether that affected things like termination of parental rights. But that's changed recently. So what happened first is, this is to say, I don't know what would happen now with what's going on now, but the Department of Justice actually, and the Department of Health and Human Services released a joint guidance on parents with disabilities, and it came about because of a really bad case in Massachusetts. Their version of what Arizona's DCS is called, Department of Children and Families. And there was a case where there was a young woman with an intellectual disability who was in the hospital. She'd just given birth in the hospital. And as lots of new moms, she was, like worried about things like breastfeeding, how to change a diaper and things like that. And one of the hospital employees, who was a mandated reporter, said, "I'm not comfortable with this." That's not supposed to be why you do a report. But anyways, made a report, and the Child Protection Agency came in and they took the kid away, and they failed to even take into account that this young woman was living with her mother, who had retired early from her job to help take care of the new baby. So she had a support system in place, but they were focusing on whether they thought that woman could independently parent the child rather than if she could parent with supports. And so that's hugely problematic here. So Department of Justice, said that this was problematic, and the kid then got reunited, but that was 2 years later. So this baby was taken away and not reunited for 2 years. But what this joint guidance said is that, yes, the ADA does apply to child protection agencies, and that child protection agencies need to individualize individualize their services for parents with disabilities, all the way through, from assessment to services they're providing. So if the parent needs parent training, then they need to provide services that fit their learning needs, not just refer them to a parent training program. So this was a big deal, and the Department of Justice has then continued to do these kinds of things, and they recently went after another state, which you might have know about. They released a finding this last December about Arizona, and they found that Arizona's Department of Child Safety discriminates against parents and children with disabilities. So I'll just focus on the parents' part. And this was based on an investigation they'd done before I came to Arizona, like back in 2020. They found that when they do these, they also make requirements of what the Child Protection Agency needs to do. Fortunately, I have a different grant from the National Research Center on Parents with Disabilities, where I already was developing a training for child protection workers that we're working on right now. So we were already doing this before this report came out. And that's one of the requirements, is that they train all child protection workers. So hopefully we're working on this in Arizona already. And when I've been doing these trainings around the last year, I've told people in Arizona, like, Arizona's next in line. This could happen to Arizona just like it happened to Massachusetts. And I was surprised but not shocked to see this report released. But I think it's good news for Arizona, because I've talked to the people at DCS, and they've got an ADA coordinator, and they're sort of ready to work on this now. So it might push us in the right direction in Arizona. So I think that's a good thing. Go back, oh my gosh, why does that say section 503? Section 504. I have to change that right now as we're talking. It's a typo. That's funny. I blow my credibility with that one. I would say the other big change that happened just this last year is in the Rehabilitation Act. And they released new regulations just this last summer. And for the very first time, they now have regulations that say that child protection agencies cannot discriminate against parents with disabilities and need to provide individualized services. So it's sort of the same thing that's in the guidance, but now these are actually in regulations. So it's the very first time it's in federal law that says that child protection agencies need to not discriminate against parents with disabilities and to provide accessible and non-discriminatory services towards parents with disabilities. So that's a really big deal. I know there's been some challenges to that since they came out, and who knows what's happening now with the new change in administration. But for right now, that's where we are. So it's sort of like a sea change in the last 10 years for parents with disabilities. The other laws here, CAPTA and the Adoption of Safe Families Act, I won't go into those, but those are the federal child protection laws. And then Medicaid, I wanted to highlight because Medicaid, we know, provides most of the funding for home and community-based services for people with disabilities in the country under waiver programs, but they do not provide services for parenting. And I'm going to go into that next. So I'm saying this as something that relates to parents with disabilities because it doesn't provide funding for what it could be providing. So I'll get back to that in a second. Sorry, I'm talking so fast. I feel like I have so much I want to share with you, and I'm just going to keep going, and then I'll stop and let you ask questions. But I did want to go over this. So, when I was developing this training, I put together some expert panels of parents with disabilities and some service providers and national leaders, and said, if you were going to talk to service providers or child protection workers and advocates about parents with disabilities, what is the minimum you would like them to know? What do you want them to know? And they came up with these 8 core sort of concepts and frameworks, which some of these are more general. And so if you're in the world of disability, they're not new, but some are particularly related to parents with disabilities, not just people with disabilities. And the first is this idea of parental support. So in disability policy and services, we talk a lot about supports. And the American Association of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities has defined supports and sort of pushed for this idea of supports to help people enhance their individual functioning. And that's how it's defined. And we've developed this whole array of services that support people to live in the community. And how they've defined it is to say to support people in their, what they call normative life activities or normal life activities. So working, going to school, using transportation, being included in the community, living in the community. Those are sort of individual normal activities. And what they haven't included is this normal sort of activity of being a caregiver. So while not everybody certainly is a parent, it's a pretty common activity that people have relationships and they have kids, and that's what people chat about when they're like, when Agnes and I were first talking, we like mentioned both of us mentioned our kids in different ways. Like that's something that's a pretty normal activity that people do. But for people with disabilities, it's not been included in this. So we list all these things, but we don't list caregiving as one of these sort of normative life activities. So this idea of parental supports is sort of broaden our notion of supports to include parenting, to include enhance family functioning, and then we can think of all sorts of supports that could potentially be funded by a program like Medicaid. So currently, how services work is you can get funding to help you with those individual activities. For example, you can get transportation perhaps if you have an intellectual or developmental disability and have a waiver, but you couldn't like technically use that to take your kid somewhere. It's for yourself. And that's the same thing if you have a PCA coming into your house. They're supposed to help, they can help you get dressed, but they're not technically supposed to help you help your kid get dressed. And so that's the idea of sort of broadening it to that. Now, let's say there's lots of people who go around that and people who are more flexible with this, but that's not technically how it's supposed to work. Okay, then there's 3 other concepts that are kind of applied differently to disabled parents. And the first is about risk factors. So in child protection, they talk about risk factors a lot. Who's at risk for abusing or neglecting a kid? But we have to remember that risk factors are not deterministic. They're just statistical associations, and we use them a lot in child protection. So it could be something like parents who are young, teenage parents are a higher risk for abusing or neglecting their children. Now, that doesn't mean that all teenage parents are going to abuse or neglect their children. Actually, most of them are not going to. But so it's just like a risk factor for abuse or neglect. But for parents with disabilities, this becomes, people use this as grounds alone, these risk factors that if they have a disability, we better remove the child because of the risk of abuse or neglect. So while there might be some risk factors that are associated with parental disability, we actually don't have good evidence at all that parents with any type of disability are more likely to abuse or neglect their kid. There is no research that shows that. And the research we have shows that parents with disabilities actually are affected by the same sort of risks that other parents are, such as their own experiences of abuse or neglect, because we know that kids with disabilities are more likely to experience abuse or neglect, or their own experiences of poverty. So the first one is to not think of parental risk factor as a cause of child endangerment and not make that leap. The second one is the good enough parenting standard. Most parents want the best for their kids, right? And we also know there's no perfect parents. I'm certainly not one myself. But when child protection agencies are assessing parenting capacity, we know they're typically not saying, are you a perfect parent? They're saying, can you keep a kid, meet the kid's basic needs and keep them safe? So this concept of good enough parenting, the psychiatrist came up with that, which actually said, kids do better when their parents aren't perfect. But when working with parents with disabilities, sometimes we hold them to this higher standard. Can they do everything independently by themselves? Like what happened in that story I told you about in Boston. The mom there, she was a little hesitant with her newborn baby, and they were sort of, and they didn't think that her living with her mother was enough. They were looking at whether she could independently be a great parent. So when parents with disabilities are assessed, we need to be sure they're assessed as to their parent, and when they're assessed at their parenting capacity, that they're able to demonstrate whether they can parent good enough with appropriate support, not that they can be a perfect parent. And sometimes we hold parents with disabilities often to a higher standard than we hold other people. And then finally is probably the most important one is this presumption of unfitness bias, which is the widespread bias against parents with disabilities about their unfitness to parent. And the nature of the bias varies based on the type of disability. We know that there's no evidence that parents are more likely to abuse or neglect their kid, but there's huge biases that can lead to providers, family members, others to assume that they're unfit to be a parent. And we've got all sorts of things we say in society, like, why aren't there we've got driver's license for driving, why aren't there licenses for parenting? We've got those kinds of things we say. And for parents with disabilities, they experience this a lot. And they also, because it's so widespread, there's this huge fear among many parents with disabilities that they're going to be reported to child protection. And I can't overstate how much of a widespread bias there is, and how many parents with disabilities are kind of withdrawing because they're worried about that they'll be reported to child protection. And we've done studies of parents with disabilities, and that's what happens when parents become, when people with disabilities become parents, they often withdraw from their services. And some of the reasons why they're withdrawing, some is that they're busy being a parent, like people are when they're parents, they stop doing things, but also because they're worried about being reported if they're reaching out, especially if they're reaching out for help. So this presumption of unfitness bias affects parents with disabilities. It also affects the service providers who are assessing parents with disabilities, and they assume because of a disability that they're not fit to be parents. Okay, so I think if we just had these three concepts, that would probably be good if we could get people to think about their own biases, think about the standards that we're using, thinking about risk factors. There were some other concepts that folks wanted people to know about. I know there's a lot of people with disability experience on this call, so I won't get into universal design so much. Universal design came from originally from the built environment, and the idea is this approach to designing for the broadest use possible. Like a curb cut. This is outside my building here at Arizona State University. So the curb cut's useful for people who use wheelchairs and people who use bikes and strollers and push carts and scooters and everything. So the idea is to apply universal design to parenting and to everything related to parenting. And to have folks who are providing service to parents to think about, how am I designing this to be, such as a parent training, or what schools are doing when they are doing programs for parents or services for parents? How are they designing this to be broadly accessible to parents with disabilities? I'm not going to go into that one too much because I've got a few more things I want to cover before we open it up. The others are the frameworks for understanding disability, which also for many are nothing new. But I just want to sort of put these in a parenting context. So the disability rights framework is sort of the cornerstone of the modern disability rights movement in the United States. That was similar to other civil rights movements in the United States, with activists pushing for policies, et cetera. And much of the emphasis has been on equal opportunity, independent living, self-determination, and pushing for this reduction of societal barriers. And these anti-discrimination laws. So the laws I was talking about earlier are really disability rights approaches. So what can we do to reduce barriers? Well, we can make new regulations to Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, or we can get child protection, get guidances for child protection agencies, or change Arizona's law to take out parental disability as grounds for termination. So that's the kind of approach we might take with this disability rights framework, is changing policies that affect parents through disabilities through legal or legislative or all kinds of regulatory approaches, the disability rights framework. The social model of disability sort of came up at the same time. It was a British social worker who came up with this originally. And this sort of, underscored the British disability movement, and it focuses on societal barriers. And it sort of takes this idea that it's not the person with the disability that has the problem, it's the societal barriers that are the problem. And so just, these disabilities, sort of a social construction that is caused by these barriers, and would suggest that these physical barriers, social barriers, et cetera, discriminatory attitudes are affecting people with disabilities. So for parents with disabilities, the social model of disability says that it's not the parent with the disability that is having an issue. It's that there's no support system for parents with disabilities. There's widespread presumption of unfitness bias. That are what we should be focusing on, not the individual parent with the disability. And then the final one is the disability justice framework, which is more of a 21st century framework for disabilities that many activists are now using. And it sort of links the disability movement with and ableism with other forms of oppression, such as racism, sexism, economic inequality, and that they're all sort of at the root similar sorts of oppression. So it's kind of builds on the other two movements, but it says it's not just changing policies, but we really need to, sort of change the whole society. And I think what's especially important about this is that it recognizes that people with disabilities, parents with disabilities, not only are experiencing ableism, but they're experiencing it differently based on their own experiences and identities. And an example from the disability justice framework might be, if you're a social worker working with an Indigenous mom with a disability, you have to recognize both the presumption of unfitness bias that's affecting parents with disabilities, but also the traumatic legacy of the boarding school movement. So like both of these things together would be affecting a parent with a disability, and different parents will have different sorts of experiences, but these can sort of combine and become even bigger, which would certainly make, affect a parent with a disability, how they would react when a child protection worker knocked on their door, for sure. Okay, so these were the 8 concepts. I'm going to talk for about 2 minutes about sort of practice interventions and models, and then we can open it up for some questions and discussion. So I say I won't go into these, but there's 2 main areas where we have developed we say interventions or practices or supports for parents with disabilities that actually have some evidence behind them. These have mostly focused on parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And first, there's quite a few studies that have shown that parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities can learn parenting skills if there's individualized or tailored programs. And these range from adapted parenting curriculum programs, in-home visits, visits with video feedback. There's all sorts of these, and it's actually an evidence-based practice, and there's a Cochrane review report on parenting skills. And this is where most of the research has gone on. And this is all great, I think. I'm a social worker, so I'm more interested in the environment than the individual, but there are parenting skills programs. There's less on the social support interventions, but there's also been some studies that have shown that social support groups, such as structured groups that have parents sort of understand all of the things I was just talking about, presumption of unfitness, bias, et cetera, and programs that help people identify informal and formal supports can help parents improve their confidence in parenting, improve their social networks, et cetera. So there are some interventions, and I'm giving you a link at the end where you can read more about these interventions, but in the, looking at time, I won't go into them in more detail. But I did want to go over some practice tips, and I could probably do the whole hour going through these best practice tips, but I'm just going to point out a few of them. And these would be the same working with any person with a disability, or actually any person at all, is that thinking of the strengths approach. And this is something that's not always taken with parents with disabilities. We did a little intervention study with parents with disabilities where we were helping them think about it was a person-centered planning approach where we had people think about their goals of being a parent and what their dreams are for their kids. And it sort of shocked me that parents would say, no one's ever asked me about this before. No one's ever, parenting, me being a parent was always considered sort of a something wrong. Not that I not only could be a good parent, but I had dreams and hopes for my kids like everybody else. So taking the strengths approach, viewing the parents as the expert in their kid and the decision makers for their kids. Those are important sorts of things that sometimes we don't think about when people are working with parents with disabilities. Also, the individually tailored services, whether it's child protection or any sorts of services for parents with disabilities, is super important. And then I'm going to point out just a few more. Understanding the trauma associated with disability discrimination is really important for parents with disabilities, especially the parental part, the unfitness of the presumption of unfitness bias. Not just that, but this trauma and why parents might not want to engage with you is really important to understand what all this historical oppression has been for parents with disabilities. And practicing with cultural sensitivity sort of ties along with that, like really thinking about who you're working with and how to better approach them. And then I'm going to just sort of jump down to being an advocate is super important. Parents with disabilities need advocates in the system, whether you're working as a support person where you have a family member with a parent with a disability, whether you're a parent with a disability advocating for other parents. We need more advocates for parents with disabilities. I'm going to point out a few resources, and a link for these is on the next page. So there is a National Research Center for Parents with Disabilities. It's at Brandeis University. It's really great. They've got information not just on research, but they've got all sorts of guides for social workers, service providers, lawyers, etc. They have it in simple language. They have it in Spanish. They have lots focused directly at parents with disabilities, like tips and other sorts of things. So that's by far the best source that has the most information for parents with disabilities. There's a few other groups. There's the Association for Successful Parenting, which is more of a ragtag sort of group of service providers, parents with disabilities, researchers. It's international, but they have national meetings. So if you're interested in this, they actually have national meetings. And then there's an international group that has a horrible acronym. It's IACID. That's the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. But they have a special interest group just on parenting with intellectual disabilities. And a lot of this research has been international by folks in Australia, Great Britain, Sweden, et cetera, and Canada. So that's a source to get information as well. And I've got two things that I created. This user-friendly guide was created also by support for the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Council. And that has the information in here, links to all of these sites, links to the laws, information on the services. So that should be helpful for you. I'm gonna, and Agnes, are we sending this out to folks? The
Yes.
Okay, so you'll have access to that. And there's also details about the Rehab Act in here. So, and that's more in a shorter narrative form as well. Okay, I just talked really fast for a long time. I'm going to unshare my screen and see what the questions are, if there are any.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So do we have any questions from the audience? You can unmute yourself, raise up your hand, or you can put them in the chat. I have also listed some of the resources that Elizabeth had mentioned, the reports, Rocking the Cradle, and also the Justice Department's findings, and then a link to Brandeis University too. So,
Oh, you're great.
so do we have any questions from the audience? I'll have to say this is a lot of really useful information, especially as new to the field and learning what you said about how there really are not much resources to parents with disabilities, and the assumption that,
Yeah.
you know, they at a higher standard, they should be great parents when that standard is not also placed on just parents. So as you said in the last, to be an advocate, what are some ways or ways that folks can be?
Yeah, well, I say probably the question I get the most. So because I've been doing stuff on this, people will send me emails, and they'll be social workers or parents with disabilities or child protection workers. And they'll say, where can I refer? Where can I refer? I want to refer someone for services. And it's not great that I have to say, well, there might not be any services in your area. So it is a big problem. So I think there are several ways to advocate. I mean, one, I didn't talk about this, but there is a state right now that's Minnesota that has actually passed a state law allowing for Medicaid waiver services to be used for parenting. It's a pilot project. Well, I'll say they were trying to pass this, and then as what happens often is that the compromise was instead that they will do a research, do a report on this. So they did a report on whether we could have a law or not. That's often what happens when we're trying to pass laws. But they wrote the report, and I have a link to the report in that user guide that you can look at. That says that this is feasible, and they put model language in there that any state could use if they wanted to try to pass a law or pass a law allowing for Medicaid waiver dollars to be used to support parenting with disabilities. I think eventually this is how we're going to fund services for parents with disabilities. You know, it might be a state like Minnesota that manages to do it first. Who knows? You know, but I think eventually this is what is going to happen. Because right now the big problem is there isn't a funding source to fund parents with disabilities. There isn't, I mean, to fund the services for parents or supports for parents with disabilities. There just isn't, there isn't a way to pay for it. So advocating for something like that, there's been a number of advocacy movements in different states where they've been changing those state statutes. And this has been going on now for, you know, I don't know when the first one changed. The first one that changed was actually Idaho. And Idaho took out its bad language about, you know, mental deficiency as grounds for termination of parental rights and put in all sorts of protections for parents with disabilities. That would be something that, and other states have now followed and done this too. And the National Research Center on Parents with Disabilities has a map on its webpage that shows all the state laws and changes that have been made. So that would be another advocacy sort of opportunity. You know, I mean, these are big picture ones. What's hard right now is there aren't a lot of, you know, ways to help aside from helping parents, accompanying parents to their child protection hearings if they get involved, spreading the word about the presumption of unfitness bias, doing trainings for mandated reporters. A lot of folks probably are mandated reporters on this call or they work with them, and that just because a parent has a disability, that's not a reason to report them. But we see that happens all the time. They report them because they have a disability, not because of anything they've done, just because they have a disability. So you're on mute.
Thank you for that. So thank you for the information. And you said the last couple of slides that you had, you did not cover. And you said it would take a lot longer to cover that. Would you be able to come back and presenting on the information?
Yeah, absolutely. I could focus just on practice, on best practices.
Okay.
Yeah, I absolutely could do that. And there, you know, there's people who are working on this, and it's a small, looking at the research on this, we just did a scoping study, and it was almost nothing for years. And then right before that Rocking the Cradle report went up, it started going up, and now it's like that. So there's suddenly people who are interested in this, and it's very international. So the US was slow in this, but Australia, Canada, UK, some of Europe, hardly anything in other countries though. But there is stuff about what works, what we could do, what changes we could make, etc.